So here I am attempting to create a first webcam video. I just bought the new camera today. It's up there. It's a webcam Logitech C920. It's supposed to be about the best thing you can buy for webcam videos. And so here it is. I'm testing a few things. I'm testing reducing the glare. I'm testing reducing the glare on the screen. I might do a bit of editing out of mistakes, a bit of jump cuts, and so I have to talk about something. And the thing that I thought would be interesting to talk about is Star Wars. Why? Well, because I've watched a whole bunch of videos about Star Wars lately on YouTube, even though in fact I'm not particularly interested in Star Wars. But I was once. Star Wars was one of the most important things in my life at one point in my life, and that was when I was 11 years old. You see, I'm 50. I'll be 51 in February, and thus I am the generation who originally watched Star Wars. I was 11 years old when it came out, I think, and I went with my dad to see Star Wars at the local cinema, which was the ABC Cinema, which is now a Jesus Centre. We queued not exactly round the block, because you couldn't really go round the block, but a long way down the street, down Abington Street here in Northampton. And it was a life-changing experience in terms of cinema. You have to understand that when I was 11 years old, there was no great science fiction. There were science fiction movies the same year as Star Wars came out. Damnation Alley came out, which was a big budget science fiction movie, and it was shit. There had been one or two landmark movies. There'd been 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then there'd been some in the 1950s and 60s. There'd been This Island Earth, and that one with the robot in it, Gort, and so on, and Forbidden Planet. But these were all kind of cheesy, except for 2001, of course, which was rather dull and then had that weird psychedelic ending that nobody understood. The idea of a huge science fiction cinema movement just didn't exist. And if you told me when I was 11 that we'd be looking at movies like The Avengers, and all the Marvel stable, and even, Batman versus Superman and Suicide Squad, whatever people think of it, we would have said, I can't believe it. The only Spider-Man we'd had on screen was an appalling, crap, really, really awful TV series. There was Wonder Woman, which was done as sort of cheesy parody, and we all fondly remember it, but it wasn't a serious take on Wonder Woman. Although it had probably the best actress possible to play her, who never got to really play the true Wonder Woman we'd all like to see on screen now. Star Wars came out suddenly in a world of the 1970s when everything was rather grey. The old post-war dispensation was breaking down. Britain was crippled constantly by strikes. Inflation was running rampant, and despite the enormous cultural efflorescence of the 1960s pushing in the other direction and trying to make things sort of exciting and colourful, the fact was there wasn't much for a child of that age. We had a black and white television, and every time, despite being a huge fan of science fiction, all that tended to appear on that black and white screen was cheesy old 1950s movies like Them, the one with the giant ants in it, and similar stuff that was 99% scientists standing in laboratories calling out the military, and 1% terrible optical effects. And then suddenly Star Wars appeared, and it was a phenomenon beyond imagining. If you're a young person today, or if you just missed it first time round, if you've watched it on video or in cinema re-releases or on DVD or whatever, you can't understand what it was like. It was so exciting that the theme tune actually came out as a disco version by a band called, or a studio band called, oh, I should have looked this up, Amico or something, I can't remember. And it was exciting just to hear that on Top of the Pops or on the radio. Weeks before the film came out, months I think before the film came out, everyone knew the theme tune, and we were all even more excited for this thing that was coming to our cinema. And when we saw it, we were truly blown away, everyone. If you were 11 years old, you had seen nothing like the assault on the Death Star. For the first time, it looked real. The spaceships looked real, both the Death Star itself and the X-Wing fighters and the TIE fighters and so on. It was the first time anyone had really pushed special effects to that point. We were all agog at the fact that it used computer-controlled cameras, because there were no computers then. Computers were things which appeared in science fiction movies with tapes spinning round and lights flashing on and off. And you didn't think of them as a everyday thing, or a thing with practical usage. That was going to come a few years later with my generation, who got video games, and then we got computers, which we could actually program ourselves. But to know that these special effects had been done with cameras that were controlled by computers was itself beyond, that was science fiction in itself. And we watched the making of and so on, and we're even more excited. Now, we now know, someone like me who's lived for another 40 years, we know that this was a masterpiece of optical effects. George Lucas created something more amazing than anyone had dared dream of at the time, and he did so by creating the special effects to realize his dream. And he created the company Industrial Light and Magic, who of course became a legend in themselves, to do those special effects. And once Star Wars came out, the dam burst, and suddenly there was a flurry of science fiction movies. Close Encounters of the Third Kind was another huge hit, although I don't think it holds up very well today. It's a bit of a weird movie. And then Star Trek, which I was a real fan of and still am. Star Trek went onto the big screen, and suddenly, instead of grainy opticals of the Enterprise, we have these glorious, massive high-resolution images of this beautiful ship. And if anyone watches Star Trek the motion picture today and wonders why you spent 5 minutes with Kirk just looking at the Enterprise while he flies around it in a shuttle, it's because that's what we, the audience, wanted to see. We wanted to see this thing in serious special effects, in all its glory, and we'd never seen anything like it before. And if you have grown up since, you can't imagine what it was like. Going back to Star Wars, which was actually 2 years earlier than Star Trek the motion picture, Star Wars, watching that scene of the assault on the Death Star was more thrilling than words can say. It was better than sex. Certainly for an 11-year-old who knows nothing about sex anyway. But in fact, compared to the average first sexual experience, it was 100 times better than that. It was just, I can still remember my heart rising inside me as this scene went on and on and on. It didn't skimp. It wasn't like 2 or 3 shots of ships just doing that. You know, they were swooping and flying across, and they're flying them in and, you know, down the trench and all the rest of it. It was just like, I never want this to end. The funny thing is that after that, we got quite jaded relatively quickly. As I said, I was 11 when this came out. By the time the next one came out, The Empire Strikes Back, we were excited, but not so excited, because we'd seen it. We'd seen the thing that made Star Wars a mesmerizing experience. And Empire has a pretty good story. Personally, I was a bit disappointed with it because it had the really awesome bit at the start, which is the battle on Hoth. And looking back, I think, I wasn't terribly interested in these characters. They're nice characters, they're good characters. Han Solo, Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker. But overall, it didn't have as much impact. It couldn't have as much impact as Star Wars did, because Star Wars was the first of its kind, and like the Beatles or your first kiss, you can't do it again. It's a one-off thing. When people used to say, who are the next Beatles, the answer is there'll never be another Beatles, because they were a particular phenomenon, first time. Likewise, that Star Wars experience was a first time phenomenon. You can't do it again. Nevertheless, Empire's, a good movie. It's possible, one can argue, you can judge it more as a movie rather than as an experience because of that, because we're used to it by that point. What's next? Return of the Jedi. By that point, 6 or so years have gone by. The 11-year-old boy with his shiny little face is prepubescent, and that boy is now 17 and embarking or considering embarking on life. I was in the 6th form doing my A-levels. That's the one, of course, with Princess Leia in the bikini. I think perhaps because George Lucas realised that those little boys were now a bit older and would quite like to see Princess Leia in a tin bikini, and she looks very nice. And that's the end of the story. And I think, looking back, like a lot of people, I went to see it for completeness. You couldn't not see it. You couldn't not go and see it. This was the end of the Star Wars saga. But that was the end of it, and you were going off to your life. And George Lucas wisely did not make any more movies. It was like, this is it. This is the end of the story. Now, at that point, it's interesting to note that he actually adapted the story. The first Star Wars movie, there's no family stuff. Darth Vader is not Luke Skywalker's father, and Luke and Leia are not brother and sister. In fact, Leia is the princess in the fairy tale, who Luke, the farm boy, is going to win. I mean, he hasn't by the end of the first movie, but there's certainly some implications of a blossoming, chaste and innocent love affair there in the classic style of fairy tales. By the second movie, everything's changed, because Lucas is now riding a behemoth of the media. He's made the movie has made vast amounts of money. It's changed the whole of cinema, and he wants more story in it. So he's got to make a sequel. And so what happens? We suddenly get this: Darth Vader is Luke's father, and Darth Vader changes. In the first movie, he's just the chief henchman. He's just a bruiser. He's a bully who leads troops in on this mission, to recover the plans. He's not, second in command of the Empire. It's quite clear in that. Tarkin, still holding Vader's leash, Tarkin, whatever the line is. And Vader is just the guy who beats people up and he interrogates them. He's a sort of high-ranking Nazi, because it's quite obvious that the Empire are Nazis. He gets called nasty names and the Force is considered to be a marginal thing. The Force gets ridiculed by someone in that conference room scene, and Vader then proves the Force works. But there's certainly no sign of this Vaderization of the franchise at that point. And I'm now calling it a franchise. Yeah. So we get to the end of Empire, and this family, Lucas has decided it's about the Skywalker family, and it's all resolved, and it has this rather naff idea where, because Vader does one good thing just before he dies, somehow he gets all of his past mass murder and sins. This guy is worse than Hitler. This guy has killed far more people than Hitler has. The Empire just blitzed a whole planet. Even Hitler didn't do that. Alderaan presumably had billions of people on it, and but there. course, you could argue they're people in a science fiction movie, so they don't really count. We never saw them. We never saw the planet. We never saw the surface of the planet, so they don't really exist. They're just a statistic, as Stalin would say. But nonetheless, in fact, has done incredible acts of evil, and it's hard to imagine why he then goes to Jedi heaven and gets to sort of wave at Luke at the end, and Luke's like, "Hey, Dad, we won't talk about the mass murder." So I never really liked that moral conclusion in Star Wars. I never liked the idea that you could so easily erase your sins simply by performing what was really a selfish act because he was saving his son. If he'd saved some ordinary, unrelated person and killed the emperor to save them, it might have more weight. But saving his son, we'd all do that, you know. The emperor had put him in a moral position of choosing between the dark side and the life of his son, and he chose the life of his son. It wasn't that he lost faith in the dark side, he just lost faith in the emperor killing his son. So, but anyway, the story was over. And I think most people expected Star Wars to quietly fade away. It would be a great thing from the 70s and early 80s, like electro pop or whatever. But it didn't. It had developed a fandom, and I'm not going to talk about that now. I think I'll do another video on fandom, actually, because it's an important cultural movement in its own right these days. But it wasn't in those days. Fandom only really starts coming into its own after that, with the growth of these really big, successful science fiction type of franchises and whatever. Star Trek: The Next Generation coming onto our screens and so on. You start getting fandom starts really coalescing as a cultural movement, but it hadn't at that point. And being a Star Wars fan meant you'd got a few of those little action figures and you liked the movies. The problem is, for me, that then George Lucas decided to first of all reinvent the original trilogy in preparation for a new trilogy. Why did he do this? I don't know, because I don't think there was a need ever. I think Lucas knew that the story was finished, and so all he could do was make prequels. That was his only choice. I thought it was a major mistake to tart up the original trilogy of movies with CGI elements and whatever, because they weren't akin to his original vision. Because you've got to remember, what he'd hit the cinemas with was revolutionary, and papering over the cracks in something revolutionary, kind of, we should see it as it was in 1977, not as George Lucas wanted it to be, but as he achieved, because it was an immense achievement in terms of visuals. But he did that, and then the prequels came out, and everybody was disappointed. And I said at the time when they were announced, everyone will be disappointed. And they will be disappointed because the people clamouring for them were people who, in the main, had been 11-year-old boys who went to see Star Wars in a cultural context where nothing of the kind had ever existed. In a cultural context where literally what you saw on the screen was beyond anything you'd ever imagined or hoped to see. You had seen crappy flying saucers in movies, and that was it. And suddenly, this thing with these amazing spaceships, the whole thing of making spaceships out of bits of model kits, I did that. I think a lot of people did it because we'd seen the making of them. We knew you could make these really complicated looking spaceship surfaces by taking bits of the sprues or whatever they're called from model kits and plonking turrets on. And me and some friends at school actually made a big spaceship which was like cardboard with bits of model kits stuck on it, and it was a bit shit, but you know, that was what we had got from that era, and we were 11 or 12, something like that. It's the kind of thing you do when you're 11, or these days when you're 40, you know, because fandom is now legit, and never growing up is legit, but that's another thing. The ultimate response to the prequels, I think, was inevitable. And I'll just say that, like many people, I've watched the Red Letter Media deconstructions and enjoyed them and laughed along with them and Mr. Plinkett. But the reality is that no movie could actually survive that kind of deconstruction. Certainly the original Star Wars couldn't. You could take, for instance, why does the Death Star have a giant hole in it you can shoot missiles down? Why didn't somebody put a grating over it? And of course, now we've got this horrible Rogue One thing, which supposedly gives you an explanation. But it's a useless fanfic explanation because it wasn't in the mind of the writer who originally created Star Wars, which was George Lucas. For him, it was just, there's this flaw which has been discovered by the rebels. It was enough background. And the major mistake with this now is that you have a story where the universe behind it, and this is really my main point, the universe of Star Wars, the only purpose of it was like the universe in any story. It was enough to support the story. That's all the universe, all the background you need in a story. Is it sufficient to explain what's going on, why the characters are doing what they're doing? You know, it's kind of like the universe of one science fiction movie might have artificial gravity, as we have in Star Trek. You don't need to know how it works. You don't need to know who invented it. You don't need to know why it's there, because it's not germane to the plot. The plot is just, well, we have artificial gravity, you know, and of course the answer is because it's pretty difficult filming a whole science fiction in fake weightlessness, whole science fiction series, so that's why you do it. But fans have a problem, and I speak as one myself, is that you want to know more. And I've come to the conclusion of late that it's the job of creators not to give them more. Once you're a fan of something, you start wanting to know, well, you know, how does the artificial gravity work? Where are the toilets on the Enterprise? What is the Kessel Run in Star Wars? And unfortunately, the franchises, because they know they can make money out of this, have said, okay, we'll fill in those gaps. And this is what George Lucas attempted to do with the prequels. He attempted to give a backstory to something that needed no backstory and never needed a backstory. And I think he knew it. That the Empire had at some point taken over and that there'd been something called the Clone Wars. These were just nice little bits of background for the main story, which is about Luke and Leia and Han and Chewbacca and Obi-Wan Kenobi and how they're going to defeat the Empire. That's all you need. You just need enough background to support the story. But Lucas, recognizing that people wanted more, thought, well, what can I do? Well, okay, I'll make prequels, because I can't make sequels because there's no other story. There's nothing else happens. You know, the Empire's been defeated. End of the story. And then he thought, well, how can I make these a bit more complex and a bit more expansive? How can I make them more credible movies? And he introduced a whole bunch of stuff about politics and trade wars and trade federations and expanded the whole Sith thing. And he made this mistake, which everyone thinks is a mistake, although I don't know why, well, I do know why, but giving a reason for the Force in the midi-chlorian thing. And people weren't happy. Now, I think they should have ended there, but instead we have this curious thing where Disney have now taken on the franchise, and people are loving the movies, even though by any reasonable measure they're inferior movies to George Lucas's prequels. They don't push the boundaries of storytelling in cinema. They don't push the boundaries of visual effects. They don't have any worthwhile new story to tell. The Force Awakens is quite clearly just a retelling. Well, it's such a shameless collage or pastiche of the original movie that it defies belief that it wasn't ruthlessly panned. If George Lucas had made that movie next, like now, if the TFA had come out as a George Lucas movie. People would have said, well, that proves that he's got no ideas. The first one was a fluke. He's a hack fraud. He's rubbish. For some reason, J.J. Abrams, and it gets universal acclaim. And now we have Rogue One, a completely unnecessary bit of fanfic explaining backstory that never needed explaining. Because we already knew, well, there's a flaw in the Death Star, and the rebels got the plans, and whatever. And you didn't need to know that. Nobody came out of Star Wars going, I wonder how the rebels got the plans then. Because it's explained in the first 2 minutes of the movie. All you need to know, the rebels have got the plans, and Vader is heading up the task force who were trying to get these bloody things back. All you need to know in a story. But because of the hunger of fans to have more detail, the backstory, to know what that droid over there, the blue one, why is it walking in that direction? I want to know where it's going, where it's come from. I want to know. So we're now going to get an endless torrent of these prequels and fill-ins and fanfics and backstories. And there's the question of why people are loving them. And I'll come to that in a second, after I just come to the point of, I'm going to have to edit here because I've forgotten what I said, what I was talking about. So people love it. And the question is why? And I honestly think it comes down to a basic bit of human psychology, which is that thing when you're a child and you've said and you've committed yourself to some point of view and you can't go back on that point of view. Psychologists, I believe, call it ego investment. It's like when an idea that wasn't yours works out better than the idea you had. You still go, oh, well, mine would have been better. Well, there's a kind of flip side of that once you've committed to the other idea being bad, anything else has to be good, if that makes any sense. And these are getting applauded simply because they're not George Lucas. It's as simple as that. If Lucas had made these movies, they'd be called tired, unimaginative, badly directed, disappointing, rehashes, retreads of old ideas. But because they're doing two things, they're giving fans a certain type of fandom, the illusion of more story. They're giving the illusion, as fanfic often does, of filling in the gaps. Then the fact that George Lucas hasn't made them combined with that creates an illusion that there must be a good story there, there must be a good product there. And this comes down to the other thing, which is that you can't fill in gaps that were not there in the original. None of this stuff, Rogue One's story, was not there when George Lucas invented the story of Star Wars. It is no better than fanfic. It doesn't tell you anything. I saw a reviewer saying, I think it was Collider, where one of the guys said, now we know why Vader was so pissed off at the start of A New Hope, as we're supposed to call it now. It's because of all this stuff that had happened. Well, that would be okay if George Lucas had thought it and directed the actor to act that way, the two actors, Dave Prowse and James Earl Jones. If he'd said, what happened was this girl, Jin Drinker, Urso, whatever, Jin Urso, has done all these things and you're really cheesed off because that's, annoyed you, that's why you're annoyed. That would be an explanation. It would be a revelation of something you didn't know before. But nobody making Star Wars knew that. They had all the motivation for that emotion in the script, and that script's only motivation was the plans have been stolen by someone, by some rebels, doesn't matter. That's why you're pissed off. It's because you're Darth Vader, you've been charged with finding these things and bringing them back. You don't need an extra. It's not just, no, that's wrong. It's not that you don't need that knowledge. It's that knowledge was not there. And this is an important thing in storytelling, just as in real life. If I'm pissed off tomorrow and then somebody writes a story about the fact that I'm pissed off because I lost the lottery, I didn't win the lottery, but that's not why I'm pissed off. I'm pissed off because something else, gone blank, but they're not filling in information, they're just making shit up. And if somebody else says, I've now got more information about this character in Star Wars, they haven't. They've just got something somebody else made up. But it gives them the illusion they know more about the movie than they ever did. In summation, what I think has been going on since the prequels is people of my age and younger ones who've picked up on it, who want to feel the way they did when they were 11 years old, sitting in the cinema watching this revolutionary new experience for young cinema goers. And you just can't do that, because you can't have your first kiss again, and you can't have the Beatles again, and you can't have something in that cultural context of the grey, low-tech 1970s, seeing this thing explode onto the screen. You can't have that in our world, which is drenched in computers and in video games and in media of all kinds, all of which is of incredible quality. We now have, HD TVs. We used to watch things on like 625 line black and white televisions in Britain, even fewer lines in America. Even then, after that, all we got was VHS cassettes, which are like looking at everything through that. You just can't have that experience again. And I think the sad thing is that you could have that experience again if somebody came up with something as revolutionary for our age, for our young people, as Star Wars was for my childhood. But when we're all just making sequels and prequels and reboots, nobody's going to do that. Star Wars is was a completely novel story, although it contained classic elements of storytelling. It contained all sorts of tropes: the princess, the farm boy, the pirate, a couple of monsters and creatures and whatever. All classic stuff. George Lucas wrote a brand new story with new characters, and we all learned who they were in the first few minutes of that movie as we met them. Having never met them before, we had never known anything about this universe before we walked into the cinema. People need to write new stories again, and then the kids of today can have that thrill of sitting in the cinema and watching something new and exciting and revolutionary, and something that parents don't get or understand. And perhaps it's time for us older folks to just let go instead of trying to relive something that cannot be recreated. Well, that's a very long video, so that's the end. Okay.